The bells began at dusk, when the rain had softened the corpses enough that their bones showed white through the mud. 17 hollow bronze notes, each one deeper than the last, rolling across no man's land like a funeral dirge played on the ribs of giants. The sound came from somewhere ahead, beyond the wire, where the crater-pocked earth gave way to deeper shadows. Brother Matias pressed his face against the trench wall, feeling the wet clay seep through his moth-eaten cassock. The sound made his teeth ache. It made his skull feel too small for his brain. Around him, the other trench pilgrims huddled in their dugouts, clutching their rusted rifles and mumbling prayers that tasted of blood and soil. The bells rang again, closer now. Through the perpetual twilight that had shrouded the battlefield for 3 months, Matias could make out a shape moving across the blasted heath. At first, he thought it was a trick of the mist that rose from the shell holes, where the dead lay fermenting in pools of their own dissolution. But as the shape drew nearer, he realized it was something far worse than an illusion. It was a cathedral walking on iron legs. The shrine Anchorite of St. Methodius moved with the deliberate gait of a pilgrim bearing an impossible burden. Each step sent tremors through the earth that rattled the bones in the shallow graves. The structure itself defied comprehension, a Gothic monstrosity of blackened stone and tarnished bronze that rose 7 stories into the perpetual gloom. Flying buttresses stretched like the ribs of some primordial beast, supporting walls that wept condensation and something thicker, darker, that might have been tears or might have been blood. The iron legs beneath it were crude, pistons and gears that screamed with each movement, leaving deep gouges in the earth. Steam hissed from joints that had never been properly sealed, carrying with it the scent of burning oil and something else, something organic and wrong. The legs moved in sequence, a mechanical genuflection that brought the entire structure forward in lurching, reverent steps. Matias had heard stories of the shrine Anchorites, mobile cathedrals that wandered the battlefield like lost souls seeking absolution. They were said to be pilgrimage sites for the dying, places where the wounded could find sanctuary in their final moments. The stories spoke of miraculous healings, of visions of the divine, of peace found in the embrace of St. Methodius himself. The bells rang a 3rd time, and Matias felt something shift in his chest, not his heart, but something deeper, something that had been sleeping in the spaces between his ribs. The sound was a summons, he realized, a call to the faithful, a promise of rest. Around him, other soldiers began to stir. Private Koenig, whose left arm had been hanging by tendons since the gas attack 3 days prior, lifted his head from his knees. Corporal Vestry, whose eyes had been burned white by the chemical fog, turned his face toward the sound with an expression of desperate hope. Even Father Corvin, the old chaplain whose faith had been ground down to a bitter nub by months of watching good men die for inches of mud, seemed to straighten at the sound of the bells. "What is it?" Koenig whispered, his voice barely audible above the constant patter of rain on the duckboards. "Salvation," Father Corvin replied, though his voice carried an odd note, as if he were tasting the word and finding it both sweet and rotten. "The shrine, Anchorite, has come for us." The structure continued its approach, each step bringing it closer to the line of trenches that marked the current front. Matias could see more details now, and each one filled him with a mixture of awe and unease. The walls were covered in bas-reliefs depicting scenes of martyrdom and transcendence, but the faces of the saints seemed to shift in the uncertain light. their expressions of divine ecstasy taking on qualities of agony and desperation. High above, stained glass windows glowed with a light that came from no earthly source. The colors were wrong, purples that hurt to look at directly, yellows that made the eyes water, reds that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The light they cast was not illumination but something else, a radiance that made the shadows deeper and the darkness more absolute. The bells fell silent. In the sudden quiet, Matias could hear other sounds, the wheeze and groan of the iron legs as they settled into the mud, the drip of condensation from the flying buttresses. And underneath it all, something that might have been singing, voices raised in harmony so perfect it made his bones ache with longing. The shrine Anchorite had stopped, perhaps 50 yards from the front line, directly between the opposing trenches. It stood motionless now, a Gothic monument to faith and suffering, its iron legs planted deep in the churned earth. The rain continued to fall, streaming down its blackened walls and pooling in the deep footprints it had left in its wake. "We should go," Koenig said, his voice thick with need. "We should go to it." Father Corvin nodded slowly. "The wounded first. That is the way of it. The dying are called to sanctuary." But Matias felt something cold settle in his stomach, a premonition that tasted of copper and ash. He had seen too much in these trenches to trust easy answers. He had watched men die calling for their mothers, had held the hands of soldiers as they bled out in the mud, had performed last rites over boys who had never kissed a girl or tasted wine or felt the sun on their faces without the shadow of war falling across it. He had learned to distrust promises of peace. The other soldiers were already moving, climbing out of their dugouts with the awkward urgency of the desperate. Koenig cradled his ruined arm against his chest, tears streaming down his face as he stumbled through the mud toward the waiting cathedral. Vestry followed, his blind eyes fixed on some invisible beacon, his hands outstretched to feel his way through the darkness. Father Corvin paused at the edge of the trench, his weathered face turned toward the shrine Anchorite. "Are you coming, brother?" Matias wanted to say no. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to stay in the relative safety of the trench, to let the others go if they must, but to keep his own feet planted in the familiar misery of the mud and wire. But the bells had stirred something in him, a hunger he had thought long dead, a need for something beyond the endless cycle of death and suffering that had become his world. He climbed out of the trench. The journey across no man's land was a pilgrimage through hell. The ground was soft with decay, each step sinking ankle deep into a mixture of mud and worse things. The shell holes were filled with stagnant water that reflected the sickly light from the cathedral's windows, and in those reflections Matias thought he could see faces, the features of men who had died in these places, their eyes pleading for something he could not name. The air grew thicker as they approached the shrine Anchorite, heavy with incense and the smell of burning wax. But underneath those familiar scents lurked something else, something that made his nostrils flare and his stomach clench. It was the smell of a charnel house, of flesh left too long in the sun, of wounds that had festered beyond healing. As they drew closer, Matias could see that the cathedral was not empty. Figures moved within the stained glass windows, silhouettes that writhed and danced in the colored light. Their movements were fluid, graceful, but there was something wrong about them, something that suggested they were not quite human, not quite whole. The great doors at the base of the structure stood open, revealing an interior that seemed to extend far beyond what the external dimensions should have allowed. The space within was vast, a nave that stretched into darkness, lit by thousands of candles that burned with that same sickly light. The candles were arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric designs that seemed to shift and change when viewed from the corner of the eye. And there were people inside, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all kneeling in the pews that lined the nave. They were motionless, their heads bowed in prayer, their bodies perfectly still. Too still. Even at this distance, Matias could see that something was wrong with them, that their postures were not those of the living, but of the dead, arranged in mockery of worship. "Welcome, pilgrims," a voice called from within the cathedral. It was a beautiful voice, warm and rich, filled with a kind of authority that came from absolute certainty. "Welcome to the sanctuary of Saint Methodius. Come, lay down your burdens. Come, find peace." Father Corvin stepped forward, his face radiant with something that might have been joy or might have been madness. "We come seeking sanctuary," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "We come in pain, in need, in hope of redemption." "All who enter here find what they seek," the voice replied. "Come, wounded ones. Come, weary ones. Come, and be made whole." Koenig broke into a stumbling run, his ruined arm forgotten in his eagerness to reach the promised sanctuary. Vestry followed, his blind eyes streaming with tears of gratitude. One by one, the other soldiers hurried forward, drawn by the promise of an end to their suffering. Only Matias hesitated, something in the back of his mind screaming warnings that his conscious thoughts could not quite grasp. He stood at the threshold of the great doors, looking into the vast interior, and felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. The figures in the pews had not moved, but he could feel their attention like a physical presence, a hunger that pressed against him from all sides. The voice spoke again, and this time it seemed to come from directly behind him. "You doubt, Brother Matias. You fear. But fear is the beginning of wisdom, and wisdom is the first step toward truth." He turned, but there was no one there. Only the rain and the mud and the eternal twilight of the battlefield. But the voice continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have seen too much, haven't you? Too much death, too much suffering. You have begun to wonder if there is any meaning to it all, any purpose to the endless cycle of violence and loss. You have begun to question the very foundations of your faith." It was true. Matias had felt his faith crumbling for months, eroded by the constant exposure to meaningless death and arbitrary suffering. He had performed last rites over boys who had never lived, had blessed weapons that would be used to kill other boys who had never lived, had offered prayers to a god who seemed to have abandoned this blasted heath to the dominion of something far darker and more capricious. "Come inside," the voice said, and now it was gentle, almost paternal. "Come inside, and let me show you the truth behind the suffering. Come inside, and let me show you the purpose behind the pain." Matias stepped across the threshold. The interior of the cathedral was even more vast than it had appeared from outside, a space that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of physical possibility. The nave extended into darkness, lit by those thousands of candles that burned with their cold, sick light. The air was thick with incense and other smells, sweet and cloying scents that made his head spin and his vision blur. The pews were indeed filled with figures, but as Matias walked deeper into the cathedral, he began to see them more clearly. They were not praying, they were not even truly sitting. They were fused to the wooden benches, their flesh melted and reformed around the carved surfaces, their bones visible through skin that had become translucent as wax. Their faces were still recognizable as human, but their expressions were not those of the living or the dead, but of something caught between the two states. Something that was neither blessed nor damned, but simply transformed. At the far end of the nave, where the altar should have been, there was instead a massive organ. Its pipes rose into the darkness above, a forest of bronze and silver that seemed to pulse with its own life. The organ was playing, though Matias could see no organist, the music emerging from the pipes and harmonies that made his teeth ache and his bones feel hollow. And before the organ, standing at a lectern that seemed to be carved from a single massive bone, was the source of the voice that had called to them. The figure was tall and gaunt, dressed in robes that might once have been white, but were now stained with substances that Matias preferred not to identify. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but its hands were visible, pale and skeletal, with fingers that ended in nails that seemed more like claws. When it spoke, its voice filled the entire cathedral, resonating through the stones and the bronze and the bones of the transformed congregation. "Behold," it said, "the truth of sanctuary. Behold the peace that comes to those who surrender their burden of flesh." Matias looked around and saw his fellow soldiers scattered throughout the nave. Koenig was in the front row, his ruined arm no longer hanging by tendons but somehow merged with the wooden pew, the flesh and wood becoming one substance. His face was serene, his eyes open but unseeing, his mouth slightly parted as if he were about to speak some profound truth. Vestry was nearby, his blind eyes now glowing with the same sickly light as the candles, his body slowly sinking into the stone floor as if it were quicksand. Father Corvin knelt before the altar, his hands pressed together in prayer, but his fingers were becoming bronze, the metal creeping up his arms like a slow infection. "You see," the figure at the lectern continued, "the flesh is weak, the flesh suffers, the flesh dies. But here, in this sanctuary, the flesh is transformed. Here, it becomes something eternal, something beautiful, something that can serve a higher purpose." The organ music swelled, and Matias felt something stirring in his own body. His feet were growing cold, and when he looked down, he saw that his boots were beginning to merge with the stone floor, the leather and flesh becoming one substance. The sensation was not painful, but it was profoundly wrong, a violation of the fundamental boundaries that separated one thing from another. "Do not resist," the figure said, its voice now gentle, almost loving. "Resistance brings only suffering. Acceptance brings peace. Surrender brings transformation." But Matias had spent too many months in the trenches to trust easy surrenders. He had seen too many men die because they had stopped fighting, had watched too many soldiers give up and let the mud and the gas and the endless rain claim them. He would not go gently into this strange transfiguration. He pulled his feet free from the stone with a sound like tearing cloth, leaving behind pieces of his boots and possibly pieces of himself. The sensation was agony, but it was honest agony, the kind of pain that came from fighting against something that wanted to destroy him. The figure at the lectern raised its head, and Matias caught a glimpse of what lay beneath the hood. It was not a face, but a void, a darkness so complete that it seemed to pull at his vision like a whirlpool. When it spoke, its voice was no longer gentle, but filled with a rage that made the cathedral stones tremble. You would choose suffering over peace. You would choose mortality over eternity. You would choose to remain broken rather than be made whole. I would choose to remain human, Matias replied, though his voice was barely a whisper in the vast space. The figure laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the screams of the dying. Human, look around you, Brother Matias. Look at what humanity has wrought. Look at the trenches, the poison gas, the endless machinery of death. Look at the children sent to die for the ambitions of old men. Look at the prayers offered to a God who does not answer. This is what you choose to preserve? This is what you call sacred? It was true. All of it was true. Matias had seen the worst of what humanity could do to itself, had witnessed cruelties that defied comprehension, had participated in acts of violence that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. But he had also seen other things. He had seen men share their last piece of bread with a stranger. He had seen soldiers risk their lives to pull wounded enemies from the killing fields. He had seen acts of kindness and compassion that shone like stars in the darkness of war. I choose to remain human, he said again, louder this time, because being human means having the choice. The figure's laughter cut off abruptly. The organ music stopped. The candles flickered, and for a moment, the cathedral was plunged into almost complete darkness. In that darkness, Matias heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of iron legs beginning to move. The cathedral was walking again, but now its steps were no longer the slow, reverent pace of a pilgrim. They were quick, urgent, driven by something that might have been anger or might have been hunger. The structure swayed and lurched with each step, and Matias had to grab onto a pew to keep from falling. The pew was warm beneath his hand, and he could feel it pulsing with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. The wood was soft, almost flesh-like, and he could see veins running through it like the grain of exotic timber. The entire cathedral was alive, he realized. The stones, the bronze, the very air itself, all of it was part of some vast organism that fed on the suffering and transformation of those who sought sanctuary within its walls. The figure at the lectern raised its arms, and its voice filled the cathedral with a sound that was part hymn, part dirge, part scream of rage. If you will not accept the gift of transformation willingly, then you will accept it by force. The shrine Anchorite has a purpose to fulfill, a mission to complete. And you, Brother Matias, will serve that purpose, whether you choose to or not. The transformed congregation began to move, their fused bodies pulling free from the pews with sounds like wet leather tearing. They were no longer human, but not yet something else, caught in a state of partial metamorphosis that was both beautiful and horrible to behold. They moved toward him with the slow, inexorable pace of the inevitable, their transformed limbs reaching out to embrace him, to pull him into their ranks, to complete the process of his own transformation. Matias ran. He fled through the nave, dodging between the reaching arms of the transformed, his feet slipping on stone that was becoming increasingly organic with each step. Behind him, he could hear the organ resuming its hellish music, the notes now discordant and wild, a symphony of madness that seemed to rewrite the very laws of physics with each measure. The great doors were still open, but they were narrowing, the stone walls flowing like water to seal the exit. Matias threw himself forward, feeling the edges of the doorway scrape against his shoulders as he tumbled out into the rain-soaked battlefield. Behind him, the cathedral screamed. It was not a human sound, not even an animal sound, but something that came from the very stones and bronze and iron of the structure itself. The sound of a predator that had been denied its prey, of a machine that had been interrupted in its function, of a divine instrument that had been turned to purposes both sacred and profane. The iron legs began to move faster, each step now a thunderous impact that sent tremors through the earth for miles around. The cathedral was no longer wandering aimlessly across the battlefield, but moving with purpose, heading toward the front lines where thousands of soldiers huddled in their trenches, waiting for dawn and the next futile assault. Matias ran through the mud and the wire, his lungs burning with the effort, his mind reeling from what he had seen inside the shrine Anchorite. He had to warn them. He had to tell the others what was coming, but even as he ran, he knew that his words would not be enough. Who would believe such a story? Who would credit such an impossible tale? The cathedral reached the front lines just as the first shells began to fall. The enemy had spotted the structure and was directing their artillery toward it, but the shells seemed to have no effect. They struck the stone walls and exploded in showers of sparks and shrapnel, but the cathedral continued its advance, unharmed and unstoppable. Matias reached the Allied trenches, just as the first of the iron legs came down on the enemy positions. The impact was devastating, crushing entire sections of the trench line and burying dozens of soldiers beneath tons of metal and stone. The screams of the dying rose into the night air, but they were quickly drowned out by the sound of the cathedral's bells, which had begun to ring again with their hollow, mournful tone. But now Matias understood the true purpose of those bells. They were not a call to sanctuary, but a dinner bell, a summoning that drew the wounded and the dying like moths to a flame. And as the soldiers crawled from the ruins of their trenches, their bodies broken and their minds shattered by the impossible sight before them, they heard the voice of the figure in the cathedral calling to them with promises of peace and transformation. The doors of the cathedral opened again, and the sickly light spilled out across the battlefield. The wounded began to drag themselves toward that light, driven by pain and desperation, and the promise of an end to their suffering. They did not know what awaited them inside. They could not imagine the transformation that would claim them, the process that would strip away their humanity and remake them into something both more and less than human. Matias watched in horror as his fellow soldiers were drawn into the cathedral like iron filings to a magnet. He saw men he had fought beside, men he had shared meals with, men he had called brothers, all of them walking or crawling or dragging themselves toward the promise of sanctuary that waited within those stone walls. He tried to call out to them, to warn them, but his voice was lost in the chaos of the battlefield. The cathedral was moving again, its iron legs carrying it toward the next line of trenches, and the bells were ringing their eternal song of false promise and true damnation. The night was far from over, and the cathedral had many more souls to collect before dawn. As the shrine Anchorite moved deeper into the battlefield, Matias followed at a distance, unable to turn away from the horror that was unfolding before him. He had become a witness to something that defied comprehension. a mobile purgatory that harvested the dying and transformed them into something that was neither salvation nor damnation, but a third option that had no name in any human language. The rain continued to fall, washing the blood from the stones and the mud from the iron legs, but nothing could wash away the memory of what he had seen inside the cathedral. The image of his fellow soldiers fused with the wooden pews, their humanity slowly dissolving into something else, something that served purposes beyond mortal understanding. He watched as the cathedral approached the next line of trenches, its bells ringing their hollow song, its doors opening to reveal the sickly light within. And he knew that this was only the beginning. The cathedral would not stop until it had visited every trench, every dugout, every place where the wounded and the dying waited for an end to their suffering. And when dawn came, when the survivors emerged from their hiding places to survey the aftermath of the night's horrors, they would find that the battlefield had been transformed. The dead would be gone, taken into the cathedral and made part of its ever-growing congregation. The wounded would be healed, but at a price that robbed them of everything that made them human. The cathedral would move on, its iron legs carrying it to new battlefields, new sources of suffering, new harvests of souls. And somewhere within its stone walls, the transformed would continue their eternal worship, their voices raised in harmonies that no human ear could bear to hear. Matias knew that he should run. He should flee from this place, put as much distance as possible between himself and the shrine Anchorite, but he could not bring himself to leave. He had become part of the story now, a witness to something that demanded to be witnessed, even if no one would ever believe his account of what he had seen. The cathedral continued its grim pilgrimage across the battlefield, and Matias followed, drawn by a compulsion he could not name. He would watch, he would remember, and perhaps, in some small way, he would serve as a voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The bells rang on through the night, their hollow song echoing across the trenches and the wire, calling to the wounded and the dying with promises that were both beautiful and terrible to contemplate. And in the darkness between the notes, in the silence that followed each toll, Matias could hear the sound of iron legs moving through the mud, carrying their burden of transformed souls towards some destination that lay beyond the horizon of human understanding. The battlefield stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast ocean of mud and wire and broken dreams. And somewhere in that ocean, the cathedral walked on, its mission far from complete, its hunger far from satisfied. The night was young, and there were many more souls to be harvested before dawn. The cathedral's path through the trenches was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. It moved from sector to sector, its iron legs avoiding the deeper shell craters and the more heavily fortified positions, seeking out the places where the wounded gathered like some divinely guided predator. The bells continued their hollow song, and with each toll, more soldiers emerged from their hiding places, drawn by the promise of sanctuary that had already claimed so many of their comrades. Matias watched from the shadows as the process repeated itself over and over. The cathedral would stop, its doors would open, and the wounded would drag themselves toward the sickly light that spilled from within. They would enter, seeking peace or healing, or simply an end to their suffering, and they would find something else entirely. The transformation was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Those who entered the cathedral did not emerge unchanged, if they emerged at all. he began to notice patterns in the cathedral's movement, rhythms that suggested intelligence behind the mechanical precision of its pilgrimage. It favored certain types of wounds, certain degrees of suffering. The dying were welcomed, but so were the broken, the mad, the ones whose spirits had been shattered by the endless horror of trench warfare. It was as if the cathedral could sense the degree of desperation in its potential congregants, could taste their need for escape from the world of mud and blood and futile death. The enemy trenches received the same treatment as the Allied positions. The cathedral made no distinction between the various flags and uniforms and national allegiances that had brought these men to this blasted heath. Suffering was suffering, regardless of the language in which it was expressed or the gods to whom it was offered in prayer. The cathedral was an equal opportunity harvester, taking from all sides with the same methodical efficiency. As the night wore on, Matias began to see the broader scope of the cathedral's mission. It was not simply collecting the wounded and the dying, but actively creating more of them. The weight of its iron legs crushed trenches and bunkers, burying soldiers alive and creating new categories of suffering. The psychological impact of its presence was devastating, driving men to madness or despair, or that particular state of spiritual collapse that made them perfect candidates for the cathedral's embrace. He watched as entire units broke and fled, their minds unable to process the sight of the walking cathedral. He saw officers shoot themselves rather than face the implications of what they were witnessing. He saw men throw down their weapons and walk directly into the cathedral's open doors, their faces blank with acceptance of whatever fate awaited them inside. The battlefield was being transformed, but not in the way the various armies had intended. The careful lines of trenches and wire were being trampled into meaninglessness. The strategic positions that had been fought over for months were being rendered irrelevant by the passage of the cathedral. The war itself was becoming obsolete, replaced by something far more fundamental and far more terrible. Matias found himself thinking about the figure he had seen at the lectern, the hooded shape that had spoken to him with such authority and such knowledge of his doubts and fears. There had been something familiar about it, something that nagged at the edges of his memory. He had seen it before, or something like it, in the moments before sleep, when exhaustion and horror combined to produce visions that might have been dreams or might have been something else entirely. The cathedral paused in its advance, its iron legs settling into the mud with a sound like distant thunder. The bells fell silent, and in the sudden quiet, Matias could hear other sounds. The whisper of wind through the ruined stonework, the drip of condensation from the flying buttresses. And underneath it all, the sound of voices raised in harmony, the transformed congregation singing their eternal hymn of praise and lamentation. The great doors opened again, and the sickly light spilled out across the battlefield. But this time, the cathedral did not wait for the wounded to come to it. Shapes began to emerge from the interior, figures that moved with the fluid grace of the transformed. They spread out across the battlefield, their translucent skin glowing with the same sick radiance as the cathedral's windows, their limbs flowing like water as they sought out the hiding places of the surviving soldiers. Matias pressed himself deeper into the shell crater where he had taken refuge, his heart pounding as he watched the transformed move through the trenches. They were beautiful in their way, these creatures that had once been human, but their beauty was the beauty of decay, of corruption made manifest. They moved without sound, their feet not quite touching the ground, their faces serene with the peace of those who had surrendered all choice and all responsibility. They found the survivors with unerring precision, their transformed senses able to detect the presence of suffering and despair with the same accuracy as a bloodhound following a scent. They did not drag their victims toward the cathedral, but rather touched them gently, almost lovingly, and whispered words in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. The effect was immediate and devastating. The soldiers they touched stopped struggling, stopped fighting, stopped even breathing for a moment as something fundamental shifted in their understanding of reality. Then they began to walk toward the cathedral, their steps slow and measured, their faces blank with the same serene acceptance that Matias had seen in the pews. They had not been transformed, not yet, but they had been prepared for transformation, their resistance worn away by whatever words the creatures had whispered in their ears. The process was efficient and thorough. Within an hour, the surviving soldiers from 3 separate trench systems had been collected and were making their way toward the cathedral's open doors. They walked in single file, their differences in nationality and allegiance forgotten, their individual personalities subsumed into a collective purpose that transcended the petty concerns of mortal existence. Matias watched them disappear into the cathedral's interior, and he knew that he would never see them again. Not as they had been, anyway. They would emerge eventually, if they emerged at all, as something else entirely. Something that served purposes beyond human understanding, something that had traded its humanity for a kind of immortality that was both blessing and curse. The transformed scouts returned to the cathedral, their mission complete, and the great doors closed with a sound like the sealing of a tomb. The iron legs began to move again, carrying the structure toward the next concentration of suffering, the next harvest of souls. The bells resumed their hollow song, and the cycle began anew. But Matias had seen enough. He had witnessed the cathedral's method, had observed the systematic way in which it was harvesting the battlefield. He understood now that this was not a random event, not some supernatural occurrence that would burn itself out and fade away. This was a deliberate campaign, a planned operation that would continue until every soldier on the battlefield had been collected and transformed. He had to do something. He had to find a way to stop the cathedral, or at least to warn others about what was happening. But even as he formed this resolution, he knew that it was probably futile. What could one man do against something that defied the very laws of nature? What warning could he give that would be believed by anyone who had not seen the cathedral for themselves? The cathedral was moving away from him now, its iron legs carrying it toward the distant sounds of battle. He could follow it, continue his role as witness to its horrible pilgrimage, but he knew that would accomplish nothing. The cathedral would continue its harvest whether he watched or not, and his presence would not save a single soul from the transformation that awaited them. Instead, he turned and began to make his way back toward the rear areas, toward the command posts and communication centers where the war was planned and coordinated. If he could reach the officers, if he could convince them of what he had seen, perhaps they could find a way to stop the cathedral before it completed its mission. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope he had. The journey back through the trenches was a nightmare of mud and wire and the constant fear of discovery. The cathedral had disrupted the normal patterns of the battlefield, and patrols from both sides were moving through the ruins, trying to understand what had happened to their missing units. Matias avoided them all, using his knowledge of the trench systems to navigate through the chaos without being seen. He reached the divisional headquarters just as dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. The command post was a flurry of activity, with officers and clerks trying to make sense of the reports that were coming in from the front lines. Entire companies had vanished during the night, their positions abandoned, their equipment left behind. The enemy was reporting similar losses, and no one could explain what had happened. Matias approached the duty officer, a young lieutenant whose uniform was still pressed despite the early hour. The man looked up from his paperwork with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Brother Matias, thank God you're alive. We've been trying to reach your unit all night, but there's been no response. What happened out there?" Matias opened his mouth to speak, but the words would not come. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he describe the cathedral and its harvest of souls in terms that would make sense to someone who had not witnessed it themselves? The lieutenant was looking at him with growing concern, and Matias realized that he must look like a madman, covered in mud and blood and the particular stench of no man's land. "There was a cathedral," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "A cathedral that walked on iron legs. It came in the night, and it took them. It took all of them." The lieutenant's expression shifted from concern to something approaching pity. "Brother, you've been through a terrible ordeal. Perhaps you should rest, get some food and medical attention. The medics have been seeing a lot of shell shock cases lately, and—" "I'm not suffering from shell shock," Matias interrupted, his voice rising in desperation. "I saw it. I was inside it. There was a congregation of the transformed, and they were singing, and the whole structure was alive, feeding on the suffering of the wounded." The lieutenant was already reaching for his telephone, probably to call for a medic or a psychiatrist. Matias grabbed the man's wrist, feeling the bones beneath the skin, remembering the way the cathedral had begun to transform his own flesh into something else entirely. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent and desperate. "It's still out there, the cathedral. It's moving through the battlefield, collecting the wounded, transforming them into something that serves its purposes. You have to evacuate the front lines. You have to warn the other divisions." The lieutenant tried to pull his hand free, but Matias held on with the desperate strength of the damned. "Brother, please, you're not making sense. There are no cathedrals on the battlefield. There are no walking churches. You've seen too much, experienced too much. This is a common reaction to the stress of combat." But even as the lieutenant spoke, a new sound began to filter through the walls of the command post. It was distant at first, barely audible above the usual noise of the battlefield. But it grew stronger, more insistent, until it filled the air with its hollow bronze voice. The sound of bells. The lieutenant's face went pale as he heard the sound, and his eyes widened with sudden understanding. Outside, they could hear the sound of shouting, of men running, of equipment being hastily abandoned. The bells were calling again, and those who heard them were answering with the same desperate eagerness that had claimed so many during the night. "What is that?" the lieutenant whispered, his voice barely audible above the tolling of the bells. "That," Matias said, releasing the man's wrist, "is the sound of sanctuary, the sound of salvation, the sound of the end of everything we understand about the nature of existence." The walls of the command post began to shake as something massive approached. Through the small windows, they could see the sickly light of the cathedral's stained glass windows, casting their impossible colors across the morning sky. The iron legs were visible now, towering pillars of metal and steam that dwarfed the surrounding structures. The cathedral had come to collect the command staff, the officers and clerks and communication specialists who had spent the war safely behind the lines. It made no distinction between the fighters and the planners, between those who pulled triggers and those who gave orders. All were equal in the eyes of whatever intelligence guided the cathedral's movements. The bells grew louder, and Matias could see the effect they were having on the personnel in the command post. Men were rising from their desks, their faces taking on the same serene expression he had seen in the trenches. They were moving toward the exits, drawn by the promise of peace that the bells carried in their bronze voices. The lieutenant was fighting the compulsion, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. "This can't be happening," he said, his voice breaking. "This isn't real. This isn't possible." "Reality is more flexible than we like to believe," Matias replied, watching as more and more of the command staff succumbed to the call of the bells. "The cathedral exists in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. It feeds on the contradictions of faith and doubt, of hope and despair." The great doors of the cathedral opened, and the familiar sickly light spilled out across the command post. The transformed were emerging again, their fluid forms moving with that same terrible grace, their whispered words carrying promises of an end to suffering, an end to choice, an end to the burden of individual existence. The lieutenant released his grip on the desk and began to walk toward the light. His steps were slow and measured, his face blank with acceptance. He had stopped fighting the compulsion, had surrendered to the promise of peace that the cathedral offered to all who entered its doors. Matias watched him go, feeling the familiar tug of the bells on his own consciousness. It would be so easy to follow, to join the procession of the transformed, to let go of the terrible burden of witnessing what could not be witnessed. But something in him refused to surrender, some stubborn core of resistance that had kept him alive through months of trench warfare and had allowed him to escape the cathedral's embrace the night before. He turned away from the light and began to run, fleeing through the rear areas of the battlefield as the cathedral continued its harvest. Behind him, he could hear the voices of the transformed congregation, raised in their eternal hymn of praise and lamentation. The sound followed him as he ran, echoing through the valleys and hills, carried on the wind like a promise and a threat. The cathedral would continue its pilgrimage until every soul on the battlefield had been collected and transformed. It would move on to other battlefields, other wars, other sources of suffering and despair. It would walk the earth on its iron legs, its bronze bells calling to the wounded and the dying, offering them sanctuary at a price that robbed them of everything that made them human. But Matias would not be among them. He would run, and he would remember, and he would carry the weight of what he had witnessed until the day he died. He would be a voice for those who could no longer speak, a witness to something that demanded to be witnessed, even if no one would ever believe his account. The bells grew fainter as he put distance between himself and the cathedral, but they never disappeared entirely. They followed him through the countryside, through the villages and towns that had been abandoned by their populations, through the refugee camps where the displaced waited for news of loved ones who would never return. Everywhere he went, he found evidence of the cathedral's passage, empty churches where the congregations had vanished overnight, hospitals where the patients had walked out in the middle of the night, leaving their beds and their treatments behind. orphanages where the children had simply disappeared, leaving behind only the echo of their voices raised in songs they had never learned. The cathedral was transforming the world, one soul at a time, one community at a time. It was not conquest in any traditional sense, but something far more fundamental and far more terrible. It was the end of humanity as it had been understood, the beginning of something new and alien and incomprehensible. And still the bells rang, calling to the wounded and the dying, offering them peace at a price that few understood until it was too late to turn back. Matias found himself in a ruined city, its buildings reduced to rubble by artillery fire, its streets empty except for the rats and the ravens that fed on the dead. He had been walking for days, driven by a compulsion he could not name, following roads that led nowhere and paths that seemed to shift and change when he was not looking directly at them. In the center of the city, he found a church. It was ancient, its stones blackened by centuries of weather and war, its windows broken and its roof collapsed. But it was still recognizable as a place of worship, still sacred in some fundamental way that transcended the physical damage it had sustained. He entered the church and found it empty, its pews broken and scattered, its altar cracked and stained. But there was something else there, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He could feel eyes upon him, the weight of attention from something that existed in the spaces between the visible and the invisible. On the altar, he found a book. It was bound in leather that might once have been white, but was now stained with substances he preferred not to identify. The pages were filled with text in a language he did not recognize, but somehow he could understand the meaning of the words. They spoke of transformation, of transcendence, of the price that must be paid for true peace. As he read, he began to understand the true nature of what he had witnessed. The cathedral was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of something larger, something that had been growing in the shadows for centuries. It was a new kind of faith, a religion based not on hope but on the surrender of hope, not on salvation but on the acceptance of transformation. The bells had stopped ringing, but their echoes lingered in the air, a reminder of the promise they carried. Matias closed the book and placed it back on the altar, knowing that he would never be free of what he had learned. The knowledge would stay with him, would eat at him like a cancer, would transform him in ways that were subtle but no less complete than what had happened to the soldiers in the cathedral. He left the church and walked back into the empty streets, carrying with him the weight of terrible knowledge. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the wind, he could hear the sound of iron legs moving through the ruins, carrying their burden of transformed souls towards some destination that lay beyond the horizon of human understanding. The cathedral was still walking, still harvesting, still transforming the world one soul at a time. And Matias was still running, still remembering, still carrying the burden of witness to something that could not be witnessed and could not be forgotten. The bells would ring again, somewhere, somewhen, calling to the wounded and the dying with their promise of peace. And when they did, there would be those who answered, drawn by the terrible beauty of surrender, by the promise of an end to choice and responsibility and the burden of individual existence. The war would end eventually. The armies would go home, the trenches would be filled in, the dead would be buried or forgotten. But the cathedral would remain, walking its eternal pilgrimage through the places where suffering was greatest and hope was weakest, offering its particular brand of salvation to those who had nothing left to lose. And in the spaces between the notes of its bronze bells, in the silence that followed each toll, something new was being born, something that was neither human nor divine, but something else entirely, something that would inherit the earth when humanity had finally surrendered its claim to existence. The rain began to fall again, washing the blood from the stones and the mud from the streets, but nothing could wash away the memory of what had been and what was still to come. The cathedral walked on, its iron legs carrying it through the darkness, its transformed congregation singing their eternal hymn of praise and lamentation. And somewhere in the distance, growing fainter with each step but never disappearing entirely, the bells continued to ring their hollow song, calling to the wounded and the dying, offering them sanctuary at a price that few understood until it was too late to turn back. The night was eternal, and the cathedral's mission was far from complete.